A Thing in the Woods. Chapter 6. Sitting here now, I still feel the echoes of that night. I feel it now, but as soon as that night was over, it began to seem like a distant dream to me. I remembered feeling scared and isolated, but none of it seemed real to me anymore. My parents woke up and we ate breakfast. We made conversation. We went on about our day, and the night before just sort of stepped back into the shadows of my memory. That's where all of this has been for years. I never forgot having these stories, but after some time passed, they no longer felt like my stories. They were like hazy stories of a kid that I used to know, and I wasn't even sure which details I could trust and which I couldn't. I didn't sleep much last night. This was caused in part by the fact that I couldn't stop thinking about finding that body in the mud. But it was also because I was eager to get up and start exploring this town. The kids in the room next door didn't help much either. When I imagined coming back here, I had imagined sleeping in one of those old, questionable motels that you always see on TV. Instead, I'm staying at a rather new, mostly clean and comfortable chain hotel built on a new road that meets up with the interstate. I got dressed as soon as I saw the first hint of sun this morning and headed toward Main Street while the world was still quiet and empty. It didn't last long. Before I could make it to the center of town, people were headed for work and school, and life was continuing on around me. I wanted to feel connected to that system of life. I'd once been a part of it. I wanted to feel as though I was home, and this was where I belonged. But I'm a stranger here now. Years of watching sappy Christmas movies about the main character returning to their small-town roots have apparently been setting me up for disappointment. I didn't see any familiar faces on the sidewalk, and I didn't bump into any old friends when I went into the coffee shop. I suppose that I might have seen someone that I once knew, but how would we possibly recognize each other? The town itself is the same, and yet it's different than I remember. That sounds like a contradiction, but it's not really. I'm sitting on a bench that I remember being here, but it's brown. In my memory, it was always black. The buildings are still the same old buildings, made with the same old bricks, with the same old history, and yet they don't look quite right to me. They look smaller, or dirtier, or not quite the right shade of color. It's like I've had the Hollywood version of this town in my head all this time. It was a careful recreation of the town itself, but it was still just an estimation of the place. It's home. I know this place, and yet I don't. I don't know what I was expecting to happen when I came back here. The dramatic stories that I have in my head look stupid to me now. This is a real place in the real world, where the same rules apply as everywhere else. I have to stop looking at this as some mythical quest and start looking at it for what it is. It's about finding answers to questions that I didn't know how to ask as a child. The place to start with that is the local library, which doesn't open for another 2 hours. I need to go there because the local newspaper didn't go digital until 6 years ago, and they never got around to putting their old stories online. If I want to read the early local reports of what happened with those bodies, I need to find them on actual paper. I have 1 day in this place, so I need to do whatever it is that I need to do here, and then I need to leave. Since the library doesn't open for a little while, I will take some time to wander around and see how the rest of the town holds up to my memory. One thing that I can safely say is that it's peaceful here. The morning air is crisp and sweet. People are rushing about their lives, but it doesn't feel like chaos to me, the way it usually does back home. I can hear kids laughing somewhere nearby, and if I close my eyes, I can remember being one of those children. I ran through these streets. I sat on these school buses. It's strange to sit here as an adult. I think that part of the reason why things feel so different to me is because I never belonged to the adult side of this town. In this place, I am meant to be a child forever. I caught myself smiling a little while ago. It's because I was walking the path from Main Street to my old house, but my mind was in the clouds. I kept thinking about the stupid games that my friends and I used to play, and how amazing it is that I only saw the one dead body. I'm sure that I knew what death was before that day, but I don't remember thinking about it. I don't remember the threat of death coming into play when my friends and I decided to jump out of trees or create makeshift snowboards out of whatever items happened to be around at the time. Most people look back at their childhood and shake their head, thinking about how different things were when we were kids. The truth is, the world isn't what changed. We are. I never thought about snakes in the field as I threw myself down a hill or sloshed through the mud beside the river. We joked about creepy guys in white vans, but we were never actually scared to go outside without adult supervision. Today, we are bombarded with news of every bad thing that happens in every corner of the world almost as soon as it happens. Someone goes missing in Oregon the same day as someone goes missing in Florida, and to everyone on the internet, it looks like a crime wave. A child's world is small. They're aware of their home and their schools and all of the people who are a part of their immediate circle, but they don't seek out every horror that they can find. This is what I was thinking about as I wandered from Main Street toward my old house. I could almost see my friends on their bikes, daring me to a race as I moved at an old man's pace. I could have driven, I know, but the point of this trip is to reconnect with the person I was and to figure out how much of what I remember is true. I never drove myself home before, so I'm not going to start driving there now. The area around my old house is quiet and out of the way. There was never much car traffic, which is what my parents loved about the place when they bought it. In order to find the house, you had to be looking for the house, because the driveway wasn't even paved back when we lived there. It is paved now, and there is a lot of very deliberate landscaping along the driveway, bushes and flowers, and landscaping rocks set up in nonsensical patterns that don't even attempt to look natural. The house had always existed as a sort of secret little hideout in my head, but now you can't miss it. They might as well put a neon sign out front. I stood across from the driveway for a little while, trying to decide whether or not I wanted to walk down to the house itself. I hate bothering people for no reason, and the people who live there now had no reason to care whether or not I used to live there. Deep inside, I wanted to walk down the driveway. I could feel the weight of my old backpack full of school books slung over my shoulder. I could smell cookies baking in the oven and hear the sound of my mother's old rock and roll music playing on the stereo. I was lost in that memory when I felt something tapping me on the shoulder, which startled me back to reality. It must have been an acorn falling from a tree, or a drop of dew falling from one of the leaves overhead. Whatever it was, I didn't see it, and there was no evidence of it on my shoulder when I brushed at it with my hand. Not everything had changed around the old house. The trees which lined the property were still there, from what I could tell, and everything across the street looked pretty much the same. It's hard to change what woods look like very much. The grass was greener and less worn around my house. There were no children riding their bikes through the area after it rained, I supposed. I also remember an old clubhouse that my father built for me in the corner of the property when I was just a baby. We'd taken it down a year or two before we left, but the ground where it once stood hadn't grown any grass. As I thought about that patch of dead earth for the first time in years, I could only picture it in the darkness of night, and I'm not sure why. There's a memory there, and it's on the tip of my brain, but I can't quite reach it. I walked toward the house. It was odd to be walking a path that I had walked countless times before, but to feel like a stranger, to come home to a place I don't live. My past was overlapping with the present in a way that I had never experienced before. The house finally came into view, and I stopped walking. It is still the same house that my parents fixed up. It's still painted the same color, though the trim around the doors and windows look much brighter than I remember. There are more flowers planted around the front steps, and more furniture on the porch. There are wind chimes, which my mother would hate, and there's a stained glass panel hung in one of the windows. I could probably pick out 100 little changes that had been made to the house if I stood there long enough. But underneath all of those little details, the house itself still looked the same. I don't know why that surprised me. I don't know what I expected to find when I got there. I had imagined a number of different scenarios ranging from burnt remains to an entirely new house to no house at all. Seeing the house so closely resemble the place that I remembered was more surreal than any of those other options could have been. As I stood there looking at the house, I heard footsteps behind me. I don't know why I didn't turn around as soon as I heard them, Instead, I closed my eyes and swallowed hard, as though I were expecting a large explosion and not the obvious question that I heard next. "Can I help you?" The voice was that of an older woman. I could tell that much before I even turned around. When I did turn, I saw her standing there, holding work gloves in one hand and a little gardening shovel in the other. She didn't look angry to see me, just curious. I smiled politely, realizing that I must look like a psychopath just staring at this woman's house, and told her, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to bother you. I used to live in this house when I was a little boy." Her eyes narrowed a little bit. She was looking at me in the eyes, searching. Then she said, "Dale Forbes?" I could see her take a deep breath, but I couldn't tell whether it was a breath of relief or apprehension. I searched my brain as hard as I possibly could, but I couldn't remember ever seeing this woman's face before. I had no idea who she was. "Colleen Waters," she told me, seeing the confusion in my eyes. "Don't worry, you don't know me. I've just heard about you from some of the neighbors." She didn't need to explain why the neighbors had been talking about me. I could tell by the way she pressed her lips together that she was avoiding the topic of dead bodies. I extended a hand, but she held up her gloves and shovel in response. Clearly, she'd been working and didn't think I'd want to be shaking her dirty hand. She offered to let me have a look around the property if I wanted to, though she didn't ask me to go inside. I didn't blame her. I'm not sure that I would have wanted to go in there anyway. I don't think there would be a point to it. I can close my eyes and walk through my old house, so I don't think that seeing it filled with someone else's knickknacks and family portraits would do me much good. I did take her up on the offer to walk around the house, though, and she walked with me as I did. We made pleasant conversation about how much things had changed since I last saw them, and I admired her chicken coop. It is the perfect place for chickens, come to think of it. As we made all of this chit-chat, I was taking in the view of the house and comparing it to my own memories. The frisbee that had been stuck on the roof for as long as I could remember was now gone. The tree near my parents' room had been trimmed back so it no longer tapped on the window. The security lights were still there, which made me smile. I'm not sure if they still worked or if they'd just been left there because it was easier than taking them down. However, it was nice to see them. It made me feel connected to my father somehow, though he'd done far more work on the house than simply hanging those lights. When we reached the back of the house, I looked up at what was once my bedroom window. I think that in that moment, I was expecting to see my younger self looking back at me, but of course that didn't happen. What I did see was a stained glass cross hanging in my old window. My first instinct was to question whether that cross was there for a specific reason or if it was just for decoration, but I couldn't figure out a way of asking that question which wouldn't result in my looking insane. I stared at that window for a few seconds, and Colleen made a comment about all of the childhood memories that must be rushing through my head. My smile grew wider as I went along with the wholesome version of things, but then I shifted my eyes to the security light beside my window, and it felt as though I were back in that room. The first night after finding that body was restless, but that isn't surprising. However, that was only the first night. It was just the beginning of what I was now trying to understand by being back in Huxley. My mind was drifting back in time, imagining the security light going on in the darkness. I remembered the sound of the gas beside my ear. I must have stood there staring at the house for longer than I realized. I was pulled out of those memories by Colleen tapping me on the arm and asking me if I was okay. When she tapped my arm, I jumped. I wasn't just a little bit startled, as one might normally be. I was scared. My heart was racing, and I felt as though I were trapped. I needed to get out of there. I tried to be gracious and pleasant as I told her that I had someplace to be and I didn't want to take up any more of her time. Judging by the look on her face, I think she could tell that something was wrong with me, but she didn't push the subject. Instead, she told me that I was welcome to stop by any time, and we parted ways. I started to continue the walk around the house, but I stopped when I saw the line of tall grass in front of the woods out back. When I saw it, I froze. I don't remember why, but something about that grass felt dangerous. I turned around and started to walk back the way I came, smiling at Colleen as I passed her. I could see her eyes shift to the grass as she smiled in response, but neither one of us said anything about it. Without turning around for even one more look at the house, I kept walking. I walked up the driveway and past the line of trees that hid the house from the street. Then I walked up the street until I was sure that I was out of view of the house. The whole time I walked, it was as if there were storm clouds hanging over my eyes. Darkness was creeping in around my vision. My heart was pounding. I couldn't breathe. As soon as I knew that nobody could see me, I stopped walking and bent over, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath. I shut my eyes as hard as I could, waiting for the panic to subside. There have always been memories in my head that I couldn't reconcile with reality. There are some that I've buried deep and may never recover, and others that I've explained away, made excuses for. It was simple enough to pick and choose what I wanted to believe when those memories were hundreds of miles away, but now that I'm back here, standing on this soil and breathing this air, I have no choice but to look at those memories head on.
This is the voice of the Embers, where stories burn and fade.